Welcome to 2020 Politics War Room with James Carville. I'm Al Hunt here in Washington. James is out at his farm in Virginia. We are proud partners with the Sign Institute of American University, but continuing to shelter in place, as I hope all of you are, hosting from our home studios. We have a fabulous guest this week, but first, please subscribe to 2020 Politics War Room on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google, or where you get your podcast. James, before we get started, you're doing well, okay? Health-wise?
Yeah.
Good.
You know, it's as well as possible under the circumstances, but which is a lot better than, 99.5% of the other people in the country. So I just do not allow myself to have any negative feelings about sitting here every day doing the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, no, exactly. Self-isolation or isolation is not the preferred mode for any of us, but it's a heck of a lot better. And you know something, everybody can adapt if you're reasonably comfortable the way we are. There are a lot of people who are suffering though, but we have
They really are. And you think of young people, if they're having to go through this. I mean, we're older, man. We've had a hell of a run. As Bill O'Reilly would say, we're on our last leg. So who cares?
Yeah. No. Well, I wouldn't. Well, I wouldn't go quite that far. I'm not.
Well, that's what O'Reilly said. He said, "Look, most of the people are going to die. Going to be on their last leg. Open up the economy."
Yeah. All right, Bill. You go. Bill, you go first. Okay.
That's you go first.
Yeah. Exactly.
Head right into it.
I haven't seen Bill, or I haven't seen Glenn Beck, or I haven't seen that crazy lieutenant governor in Texas volunteer to go first, but we'll see.
No. And this guy in Indiana now, he's another genius.
Oh, the congressman. I'll tell you. Well, there's a lot.
Yeah.
Well, let's go through some of them in a minute. We have so much to talk about. Before we get to Trump and the virus, let's talk about Wisconsin. It was a primary in early April. The Democrats tried to postpone it. They tried to make sure you could defer absentee ballots. They could come in postmarked a week or so late. The Republicans said, absolutely no way. We're going to force an election on April the 5th. They won in their state Supreme Court. They won in the United States Supreme Court. Democrats thought it would be a disaster. And guess what? A liberal state justice Supreme Court nominee won big time. Probably tells you pretty much, doesn't it, James?
It does. There's one thing that Marquette, they have a good poll, the Wisconsin poll. That guy that runs it, Charles Franklin. I think people have a lot of respect for him. I would give anything, and you could do it very accurately because you'd get a list of people that voted and just call and said, I see that you voted in the election. Did you vote mostly, the reason voting mostly to vote in the Democratic primary, or was your reason to vote more for the Wisconsin Supreme Court race? Because what I'm hearing a little bit, and I'm hearing this from some kind of high-end analysts, is, yeah, they did well, but, when you have a primary, that skewers the turnout. I don't think that's why they came out to vote for Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders. I don't think that was the factor that drove these people to stand in line that long for a race that has already been decided. But I would just love to see, and I think that would be a data point that would be valuable. If people would gravitate toward it, and if anybody knows Charles Franklin at Marquette, that's my idea. And it'd be easy to draw the sample. And you could ask for, you could even just do it to registered Democrats if you wanted to. In a state like that, 10 points is a lot.
It's a landslide. I think there are two anecdotal facts that suggest that you're right, that it was that Supreme Court race that brought people out. One was the money spent. I mean, the money the two parties spent beforehand was not on the presidential race. The Democrats weren't spending money on Biden. They were spending money on that race. Secondly, the Milwaukee Journal, pretty good newspaper, most of the reporting they've done since then and talking to voters said, this is why we voted. It was that Supreme Court race. I think a caveat for Democrats, it's very good news for Democrats, not just the 10 or 11 point margin, but where it was, the suburbs and good turnouts in places like Madison and not so good in rural areas. The small caveat is that the presidential race has some impact. And with Trump on the ballot, it probably would have made some difference, but not 11 points.
Yeah. The other thing is, as usual, is if you're having been regular listeners to this podcast, you noted Tom Etzel is at the very highest esteem by the host of this podcast. And he had a typically, brilliant column this morning. And I just think, I put it in print and I'd say it here, barring some way to stop people from voting, this election is going to be a big election for Democrats. It just is. And I know Nate Cohn, Times can do Senate polls. There's a Senate poll in Arizona. I don't know how good it is. It has Mark Kelly up 52 to 41 or something. And you're not. That's
not out of line with other surveys.
Yeah, you're going. And now we got Burr selling his Capitol Hill townhouse at above market value to a lobbyist. And I know that's not Tom Tillis, but you wouldn't if it was two Democratic senators. If Tim Kaine did that, you would worry about Mark Warner.
Well, James, it's even worse. I mean, there's Richard Burr. There is one of the top officials in the state. I think a chairman of the state Republican Party was convicted of fraud. There was the case, the North Carolina congressional race in 2018, fraud. The Republican Party down there, they prove Lord Acton's theory that power can corrupt and absolute power totally corrupts because they have been a corrupt party. And I think Tom Tillis is a dead man walking.
I do too. I do think, but maybe I'd have to reevaluate after the election. But I've always contended that Trump will get a higher percent in Wisconsin than he will in North Carolina.
Yeah, no, I agree. A Democratic incumbent governor who has gotten high marks on dealing with this pandemic, a good Democratic Senate candidate, and a weak Republican Senate incumbent from a state that basically went for Obama in 2008, almost went for him in 2012. It is a purple state that I think is heading more towards Virginia than South Carolina.
I think North Carolina's heading more toward Virginia, and I think South Carolina's heading more toward North Carolina. The other thing, Harrison will break 46.
He's the Senate candidate against Lindsey Graham in South Carolina.
He will break 46. If it gets big enough, who knows? I mean, remember, we got an off chance in Kansas. Very, very, very good private polling has Collins behind in Maine. And she's always depended on about 25% of the Democrats in Maine voting for her.
She's not going to get them.
She's not getting remotely close to that now.
I think there are a number of very promising Senate seats, and it is. I never have disagreed with Tom Etzel, and I'm not going to disagree with him now. This is headed towards some kind of a big mandate in November, and Trump will do anything he can to stop it. I mean, this week, James, we keep saying, there's nothing new. He just is Trump. But this week he rises, he sinks to new. What's the name of that river again in Louisiana?
The Atchafalaya River.
Yeah, where, they said
and the legend
has no bottom. And that's what we keep thinking, and Trump finds a new bottom every week. I mean, I love defunding the American contribution to the World Health Organization during a global pandemic is probably as dumb a move as you can make. For the first time ever, the IRS will be sending out checks that has the president's name on it. This is a man that's desperate, and his press conferences have become comical. Those 5 o'clock follies are follies, and he's just a mean, angry, vengeful man. And James, I think he's just hurting himself every day.
Yeah. Well, it's hurting himself, yes. And now I think it's just a matter of time before a lot of these incumbents and McConnell and everybody starts getting very itchy about all of this. I really do. I know if it was a Democrat, they'd be utterly panicked. I mean, they're so scared of Trump, and they're so scared of the Trump's base. But I got a feeling that Tom Tillis is going into caucus, and Martha McSally is going back to the caucus, and Cory Gardner is going back to the caucus, and Susan Collins is going back to the caucus. All right, and Johnny Ernst is going back to the caucus, and Steve Daines is going back to the caucus saying, hey, look, this thing is not going that well on the ground right now, just so you know.
Right.
And you're going to see more and more of that.
You're going to. I think one thing to check is primary dates. Any place that a primary is over, I think you're more apt to see it. The one that surprises me, who I thought would be doing more of that, is Cory Gardner in Colorado, because Colorado is not a Trump state, wasn't in 2016, will be even less so in 2020. He will probably end up running against a popular former governor, John Hickenlooper. And Cory Gardner is in the same situation as Tom Tillis, a dead man walking, if he wants to keep staying part of that Trump bandwagon.
He can't break with Trump. If he does, he's done. All right? The Trump base will turn on him. His only hope is that Trump gets more popular. If he goes to post right now in Colorado, he loses by 8 points. He doesn't just lose. And so, I mean, it's like, you say, look, you can take this drug. It ain't going to keep you alive for long, but it's going to keep you alive for now, and they're working on something else. Well, you say, okay, let's go with that. And none of them are like tempted to break, because if they break, they'll turn on them like crazy. And they're kind of caught betwixt and between, and you just got to keep applying the pressure. But their only hope is, somehow or another, it goes away in the summer and the economy comes back, and, we're all happy in November. I don't even think that would win for them, but that's their hope.
Yeah, maybe the only thing they have, you mentioned Mitch McConnell. I want to tell anyone who hasn't, take a look at the New Yorker, Jane Mayer's long profile of Mitch McConnell. It's a really well done, superb journalism. We always expect that of Jane Mayer. She's terrific. We used to work together. And James, one of the little things in there that fascinates me is that he doesn't have the support, this is Mitch, of his 3 daughters. I mean, that tells you something about someone. There are always family squabbles, but that one was more striking.
Yeah, I mean, I love Jane Mayer. I think Jane Mayer's going to, 3.5, pick a damn low number in terms of a journalist. Mitch McConnell, what really screams at you at that story, he's literally a man without a soul. I mean, there's nothing, absolutely nothing other than power that Mitch McConnell believes in, and taking care of his donors. It's like
money.
Stunning.
Yeah, power and money.
And he kind of started as wanted to be like almost a John Sherman Cooper. I mean, and just,
who he worked for.
Yeah. It was just stunning. Like, you peer into his soul, and it's just vacant. I mean, Rand Paul, he does kind of believe in that goofy libertarian stuff at some point. All right, I believe that. I don't think that. I think Pat Toomey, like, at some level, I'm probably smart enough to know it's not, but it started out at least believing and trying to believe in this goofy supply side stuff. I don't know. I think I think it's possible that people that you disagree with have some sense of something. He has nothing. That was the amazing thing about that story to me.
Yeah, it was, and she got the fellow who he is described as his mentor, the person that really is more responsible for inspiring him to go into politics, and that person said exactly what you just said, that Mitch believes in nothing, that he is sold out of soul, assuming he had one. But it's a good read. The New Yorker this week, Jane Mayer. Let's stay on Republicans for a while. We can go to Democrats, but let's talk about the way some of these Republican governors are handling things, James. Now, I think some deserve a lot of credit. Larry Hogan in Maryland, and Charlie Baker up in Massachusetts, Mike DeWine out in Ohio, but there are some others, aren't there?
Well, I mean, DeWine, I'd give even more credit than Hogan and Baker, because Hogan and Baker are in definitely blue states.
Blue states, right?
DeWine is a governor of a pink state. I mean, we might have a chance because of extraordinary circumstances 2020. So, I mean, I would just rank him first. Not that I think Baker and Hogan are not doing anything but a good job, because it's a little bit tougher for him. Yeah, I think 2 people All right, Tate Reeves in Mississippi, but we just give him a pass because you just know he's stupid. All right, DeSantis stands out, and Brian Kemp stands out, but the one that stands out the most in my mind is South Dakota. I mean, she
former Congresswoman Kristen Knoll.
And she's everything, and she's bragging how she texted with Jared Kushner, and it was all everything. And then, of course, you have this horrific breakout at this meat processing plant that could adversely affect the meat supply in the United States.
Yeah, you know? and she's been she's a denier. She's a
total denier of everything. And I mean, it's banal stupidity. All right. I think DeSantis is he's just like a Trump guy. All right. He made a bet. He won on Trump. The same thing with Brian Kemp. And Brian Kemp is a really stupid man. You can see him. You can look at him. And the overwhelming thing that emanates from him is stupidity. And he said, what was it, in April? That he just found out that you didn't have to be symptomatic to catch this thing. Oh man, come on. How could you be so stupid to even say that, to think that?
That's a governor of one of America's 10 largest states.
Yeah,
right?
Yes. It's one thing to be stupid enough to think that at some period of time. It's another thing to be stupid enough to say it. But I mean, there's Greg Abbott in Texas, the guy in Oklahoma, he's too stupid to even bring up. It was, showing his family out eating in a restaurant in Oklahoma City.
We talked about this on the phone the other day, but I would really like to see an in-depth story comparing California and Florida, two huge states. California almost twice as big, but both tourist destinations.
I'm here. It's nice to hear you.
I guess that's the secretary, Albert. It's all right. That's good. Don't erase that. Put it on the show. We need those spontaneous moments. Yeah. We'll talk after we talk to the secretary.
Yeah, I mean, James is fascinating as we think we are. We have a guest this week who is even more fascinating. Only in America could two hacks like us be graced by one of the world's most distinguished diplomats, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who's publishing her 7th book, Hell and Other Places. She's published more books than some politicians have read. Madam Secretary, we are honored. You left Foggy Bottom 19 years ago. Since then, you've started a company, been a full-time professor, served on numerous boards, and chaired countless global commissions, given hundreds of lectures, commencement addresses, and in your spare time, written 7 books. I can't wait for the next 19 years. Why? Tell us about Hell and Other Places.
Well, thank you, and I love being on with you. Let me just say, there were questions kind of what I would do after I'd been Secretary of State. And people would say, how do you want to be remembered? And I said, I don't want to be remembered. I'm still here. And as we were leaving, I was trying to figure out what I would do. And so somebody said, well, you can go back to teaching, or you can be chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, or do things with the Aspen Institute, or start a business and give speeches. And I said, fine, I'll do all of them. And so that is what happened is I have been doing all those things. And in my own head, they all fit together. I learn from one thing or another specifically, and I enjoy it very much. And then you both know me very well, is it took me quite a long time to find my voice. And so now I'm not going to be quiet. So that's where I am. And the title of the book I originally chose because of the most famous thing I ever said was, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other. It was so famous it ended up on a Starbucks cup. And so that's how the title came about. As I've chosen other destinations, I didn't really think at the time how relevant it would be at the moment it came out.
Well, it's a terrific book. I read it the other day. Lisa sent it to me online, and I read the whole book online. There are wonderful stories there. I think my favorites, Madam Secretary, were about Czechoslovakia, about finding your grandmother's journal, about your relationship with Havel, and maybe one of my favorite anecdotes is while you are exuberantly showing your grandchildren around Prague, one says to another, "She's crazy."
Well, I tell you, the background of that is there is a wonderful book called The Legends of Prague that I had tried to find because the Czechs are very well known for their puppets, and I had a puppet theater, and there was this character in it, which was what is called a merman, and I was trying to figure out what the merman did. So I found a book, and the Czechs have a very strange sense of humor, and so the mermen lived under the bridges of Prague, and their job was to take the souls of those who had drowned and put them into little pots. But when not enough of them drowned, they drowned them. And so then this book goes on to point out various real places in Prague and give stories with them. And I'd retraced it. There were these headless warriors. And I was trying to explain the thing to the children, and that's when they said she's crazy. And that's probably true, but it's Madeleine's Tour of Prague.
Well, the book's a fascinating read. You know, you are an optimist. You really have always been an optimist. But in reading the book and going through some of the stuff you've written before, when you write about the Middle East and China, Russia, boy, it's pretty hard to be an optimist, isn't it?
Well, I do say I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And so I was recently describing myself. Was somewhere where they told me to describe myself in 6 words. So I said, a worried optimist, a problem solver, and a grateful American. And so that's how I kind of deal with the fact that there are issues, but I did count on the United States being a problem solver and understanding what our role was as a partner to other countries to deal with an increasingly complex world.
Well, that's a perfect segue to the substance guy on this podcast, James Carville. James, take over.
Oh, thank you, Madam Secretary. I've interviewed a lot of people, been around people. You're one of the people in this world that actually intimidate me, so I do not be too nervous here. So, this is a hypothetical thing, but all too true. I have a place in South Mississippi, and the guy that mows my lawn, Ben Bob, let's just call him that. You know, he's a nice guy, he calls him Mr. Carville and stuff, and he's a kind of Trumpist guy. And so I would assume I had this conversation with him, which is likely. And I said, well, you know, how you hanging on the COVID thing? And he said, well, you're doing this. And he said, James, why do I care about what the hell is the WHO? And why do I care about that? And don't you think Trump is right that they were lying to us and we give them too much money? What would you tell me to tell him?
Well, I'm glad because this has come up a lot and it explains very much how I see that problems need to be solved in the 21st century. There is no question that the virus knows no borders. So the question is how you deal with it throughout the world. And you do need to have cooperation among countries. I was at the UN, as you know. And one of the issues is how the United Nations organizations work. They are imperfect. I have said that people and organizations in their 70s need a little refurbishing, and the UN is 75 years old. But the WHO has purview and understanding of what's going on across borders, and it is a functioning international organization that needs help. The United States cannot solve this the virus war by itself because it comes from other places, as we know, and we need their cooperation. And while it needs reform, we can't get it if we're not at the table. So I think we need to be a part of it because no matter what, we depend on what goes on in other countries. If we think about trade, somebody has to buy what we're selling. And so we are interconnected. So tell your guy, by the way, I believe fully in respect of those who have different views. And so I would spend some time explaining it in a non-patronizing way if I could.
based on what you know as of now, is there some reason to believe that China influenced? Because there's an AP story that said China delayed 6 days from telling the world that there was it was possible to transmit from animal to human. By all the evidence I see, we knew that a long time before January. But at any rate, is there some validity to the fact? Not the fact. Is there some validity to the idea that China pressured the WHO for a limited period of time to not go public with what they knew?
Well, I do think that China has a lot to answer for as far as the virus is concerned. I mean, in its initial cover-up and continuing lack of transparency and the failure to cooperate fully with American and international organizations. I think the truth is that as of the moment, we do not know what the influence has been, but I do think that China does have a lot to answer for. From what I can tell of kind of a TikTok on the WHO, they did try to warn about it earlier, but I think we do need to look into it. I think the problem is that we need to look forward now, and we can really look back and analyze all this. But at the moment, we need to figure out what is the way to deal with an international problem that is going to need an international solution, even if our main concern is what's happening to the American people. But the American people are dependent on what happens in a variety of countries that the international environment has to deal with.
Well, so this is a question, it's kind of maybe unfair, but I asked Albert this question yesterday. So let's, because we assume things here. And so Vice President Biden's elected president of the United States, and he picks up the phone, and on November the 15th, he calls you and says, Madam Secretary, I'm slammed, as you can imagine. One of the things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to appoint a commission to look back at this and find out and tell American people what went right, what went wrong, blah, blah, blah. Do you have any ideas of someone that could head this commission that would have credibility and knowledge and everything else to do that?
I don't, frankly, but I'll think about it, because I do think that it's going to have to be somebody that not only understands some of the medical aspects and understands the science of it, but at the same time is capable of understanding how an international system works. And it doesn't have to be an American. I think it probably would be good, because we have this tendency of not wanting to deal with those that are foreigners. But I do think that the commission itself would have to be multinational. And there are a lot of people that have been involved with WHO or the United Nations or health that should be a part of it. There are questions, but are deciding that we're not going to support it, the WHO, or stop paying our dues or whatever, is counterproductive, because then we have no influence. And I have my own experience with that. I don't know whether you'll remember this, but what happened was that when at the beginning of the Clinton administration, we were behind in our payments to the UN on peacekeeping operations, and deliberately decided to cut what we owed, and meant that I didn't have the kind of influence I needed to do reform, leading the British, our best friends, to deliver a line they'd waited over 200 years to say, which was representation without taxation. And we just don't have the influence. So we have to figure out, we cannot do this by ourselves. There's no question. And I think it is worth having a commission, not only to deal with this, but a commission to analyze what went wrong with the United States government, so that it isn't just a matter of blaming previous administrations.
Madam Secretary, I think James's question brings up the larger point of American leadership. For most of the time since World War II, whether it was other pandemics like Ebola more recently or the financial crisis, America has been a global leader. I think it's safe to say that America is not that today by choice of this president. How much does that matter, and who fills the void?
I think it matters a lot. You talk about Ebola, but also HIV/AIDS, and President Bush and PEPFAR, and setting up an AIDS fund.
Right.
And Also, trying to do something that needs to happen now is to involve the private sector more in all of this, the public-private partnership. And I think that I so believe in the United States, and I think that, President Clinton was the first one to say that we were the indispensable nation, but I said it so often it became identified with me. And there's nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It just means that we need to be within a group of partners. And I think that's what has to happen. Our diplomacy has to understand that we need partners. We need to find countries where we're on the same wavelength, that the problems are the kind that require that. And it's not simple because we've offended everybody at the moment. And we are going to have to find countries and leaders that want to work with us and trust us, because we cannot do it alone.
Well, that brings up, if there is, as we expect there will be, a President Biden next January 21st, how hard will it be to recover from this vacuum of leadership?
Well, I think it won't be easy, but I have to say this. I obviously am supporting Vice President Biden, but partially I have known him a very long time when he was senator and chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. And I think as much as I've loved working for various previous American presidents, I don't think there's anybody that has as deep an understanding of foreign policy as Biden does from all his activities, and a good reputation. He knows how to get people around him. And I think, but it is not going to be easy. I've been to a number of national foreign policy meetings. I think some of you may have heard about the most recent Munich National Security Conference, where people thought we were a joke when there's just saying how important we are without thinking through how it affects other people. We have a lot of bridges to mend, and not just because it's do-goody, but because it is what is necessary in order to make America safe and to help our people. We can't do it by ourselves.
You want to suggest a couple of people who might be a good Secretary of State?
No, I'm going to stay out of that.
I thought you would do that, James.
I wanted a good, feel-good, bipartisan story. So Holbrook regales me all the time about how he and you convinced Jesse Helms to support the AIDS funding, and I think it's a great story.
Well, I thank you for asking it, because I do love to tell this. So what happens is that I am UN ambassador, and he becomes chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. And what happens is all of a sudden I get a call as I'm up in New York, and I've been invited to give a speech to a women's college in Raleigh. So what happened was I said, well, I'd love to think about doing it if you go with me. And he said, well, that's interesting. So let me think about it. So he calls back and he says, I've just changed my schedule and I'm going with you. So we do that. And when somebody's introducing you, they don't say, this is the stupidest person I ever met. And he couldn't have been nicer. We're flying back together. And all of a sudden, a few weeks later, I get a call from him saying, would I go with him to his alma mater, Wingate? And so he picks me up in Raleigh. And we're driving around North Carolina looking for barbecue places and just chatting. And then he had just had a hip operation or something, and he could barely get out of the car. So I am helping him get out of the car, hanging on to him. And all of a sudden there's a picture and it says The Odd Couple. And so I gave a speech in front of him, and, we just had an interesting time. Then I get named Secretary of State, and I go in to do my round of calls, and he says, Ms. Madeleine, we will make history together. And we did work together on the expansion of NATO. And he really was somebody that became a good friend, and people don't believe it, but I believe in bipartisanship. And so I would like to see a Republican Party that actually works with us and doesn't make things up. So I can be friends and am very much into bipartisanship.
Well, I'd like to see me, get into Harvard Law School. All right. I mean, we got a dream. All right. we got a dream on the NATO expansion. as you look back on that, and of course Putin used that, if you look back, do you think we were too aggressive in expanding NATO, or was there different? But it might have been a different way to go about this.
I have to tell you, one of the things I do is always go over decisions and try to figure out if they were right thing to do. And believe it or not, I was not the pusher of this from the beginning, because here I was born in Czechoslovakia, and I didn't want to be a special pleader. But the truth of the matter is that the Soviet Union disintegrated. And it isn't a matter of whether we won the Cold War. They lost the Cold War. The system didn't work. And there were these countries that had been put behind the Iron Curtain at the end of World War II. And they wanted to have a different position, and they wanted to be a part of it. And I can't tell you how much time I spent, as did President Clinton, trying to respect the Russians and work with them, worked with Yeltsin, all kinds of things. We even said at some point, if they wanted to, they would be able to join NATO, and tried to figure out what to do. And I know there's some people who think it was a mistake. I do not think it was a mistake. Just imagine what would have happened if we hadn't done anything. I do think that when actually General Shalikashvili and I were going around initially from country to country talking about the Partnership for Peace, which was the progenitor of it, and could see that they wanted to be a part of it. We told them it was not a charitable organization, that they had to do their share. And so that's the part that has to be worked on. But I think it would have been a mistake not to expand NATO.
Yeah, Madam Secretary, I know you have to go, and you do have a long record of having bipartisan both relationships and friendships. You talked about your dealings with Jesse Helms on the United Nations and other things, and in your book, you talk about, you disagreed with your successors, Colin Powell and Condi Rice, on some policies, but you really had a warm respect and friendship with one another. I get the sense from your book you don't have that same feeling about Secretary Mike Pompeo.
Well, that is true. But the bottom line is that what happened when I became secretary, I reached out to my predecessors, and some of them reached out to me. We created a group that really spent time together. I have had only one call with Pompeo when he was director of the CIA, and I'd been on the External Advisory Board, and he told me that my services were no longer needed. He quickly called me when he was named and said he'd been named. I said I would be as helpful as I could be, and I think it's only so he could say he had talked to every former Secretary of State. I have not heard from him since. And one of the fun parts, I don't know whether you ever watched Madam Secretary, but there was this program where Colin and Hillary and I were invited by Teo Leone to the State Department after something that had happened at the White House. And I got an unscripted line in. As we sat down, I said, Madam Secretary, it's wonderful when the current Secretary of State calls her predecessors in to consult. We used to do it all the time. And they left it in.
That's fabulous. I hope everybody who's listening will read To Hell and Other Places. Madeleine Albright, we forgot to mention in that long resume of yours in the last 19 years, you've also been a star of television shows and movies too. So there's no end. We look forward to the next 7 books and to keep having you on. And at some point, have your grandchildren had a chance to read the book yet?
No, but they have been a part of it. They're very funny because they've come to a lot of my other events. And my youngest grandchildren who live in California said after one, we didn't realize that Grandma Maddie was so funny. So I'm hoping that they'll see the humorous parts of the book.
Wow, when you can have a grandchild say that grandma's funny, that's one of your greatest accomplishments. Thank you so much for being with us. And again, terrific book. We hope we can talk to you again.
Great to be with you. I loved watching and talking to both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. It was a huge honor for me. I appreciate it. Thank you, ma'am.
James, I have you?
Yeah, I'm right here. That's quite a...
You think we've been elevated?
It's what a fascinating person.
Oh.
I mean, what experiences and history and, all the things that she's been witness to, and she sounds so strong and assertive and, brilliant.
I'll just say it too. I mean, her personal story is extraordinary too. They escaped from Nazi Germany. She came over here. It was an incredible story. And then she married this very wealthy newspaper heir. And this is all in the book, so I'm not talking out of school. In 1982, he came and said, "I've fallen in love with another woman. I'm leaving you." At which point she did. I mean, that's a devastating thing to happen. 3 kids. And look what happened in the next, 40 years. She's really remarkable. And one more story. I asked her one time to talk to the Wake Forest in Washington class, and we were sitting around a table, and everybody had a name card up, and the woman next to her, a young student, was named Madeleine. And the secretary said, "I like that name." And the student said, "I was named after you."
I love that.
So she's had a remarkable life. All right. We've gone high. We've followed Michelle Obama's advice. Now let's get back low again. You were talking about the governor of South Dakota, who has really screwed up, and the governor of Florida.
I mean, you can't throw in Oklahoma and, it's just I looked at the Quinnipiac poll, which is a pretty good poll. 89% of the people in the country, and like huge numbers of Republicans, support the stay-at-home stuff. I mean, my brother, my family, we ain't getting out of here, and they're not. They might have voted for John Bell. I don't discuss politics with them a lot. They're not even, and Trump could tell them to not stay at home. It would matter not one whit. And I somehow or another, he's so disillusional. He thinks that people are dying to go back to work. He thinks that if he tells them to, they will. And then all he needs to do is throw the switch. I mean, he's not in any way, shape, or form in any reality. People are going to stay this way. They're doing it not so much because they're told to. They're doing it because they want to do it.
And they're scared.
Yes.
As they ought to be.
For good reason.
There ought to be. I mean, I'll tell you this much. I mean, there is no greater baseball fan than you and me. And if for any reason, which they won't, but if for any reason Major League Baseball would start again in July, I sure as hell am not going out to a ball game.
I wouldn't go if LSU was playing Alabama. I wouldn't go to the game. I wouldn't even be tempted to go to the game. And neither are other people. But I mean, just look at that. Look at the data, and I've seen multiple data points, and the poll is not going to be that. And by the way, they're just poll registered voters. I mean, but it doesn't matter. There's overwhelming support. All these governors that have these things and the mayors that have it, all their numbers are astronomical. Look at Ron DeSantis, has now one of the worst governors of any governor in the country.
Well, I would love to see a story. We talked about this today. I would love to see a story. I was mentioning this before the secretary got on California and Florida. They are similar states. California's a lot bigger, and the record in California has been just light miles ahead of Florida. Far fewer per capita cases, deaths, and that's because of leadership. It matters.
The stupidest thing that a human being can say is it don't matter who's in there, it's all the same stuff.
Right.
Let me tell you something. If we didn't have John Bell and we had Eddie Rispone in Louisiana, and that's just not my democratic opinion, I don't know of a single Republican, and I know a lot of Republicans, right, that doesn't have the same sentiment.
The two gubernatorial choices in Louisiana.
Eddie Rispone is this guy, and he said, I'm a businessman. And John Bell Edwards was a son of an elected sheriff in a pretty important parish in Louisiana, was Army Ranger, went to LSU Law School, was in the legislature for 2 terms as the minority leader of the Democrats. Thank God, and his brother is the sheriff of Tangipahoa. Thank God we got a politician in charge. Thank God we got a politician in charge.
James Carville, be safe this week. We'll be with you next week. Thank you for listening. This was a really good show. We could have Madeleine Albright every week. We'd be something, wouldn't we? I hope you'll follow the show on Twitter and Instagram It's at Politics War Room. Please subscribe, rate, and review. Be generous. The podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. For James Carville, I'm Al Hunt. Safe out of here.